Good morning, everybody. Happy day before Valentine's Day. It is February 14th or 13th, 2020. I'm Patricia Dugan, your host of the Online Traffic Meetup. I'm coming to you live from San Francisco. It's 9 a.m. here. And we're super excited to come to you today and have you join us today, actually, for a very cool, unique Traffic Online Meetup. So again, my name is Patricia Dugan. I am the Director of Community at Containus, and I work on marketing initiatives in which we make cool and creative things for all of you developers, users of traffic, and those who are interested in finding out how companies are using traffic and mesh to answer interesting technical challenges. So what I'd like you to know today about Containus is we are hiring. So if you're interested, please look at our careers page. And also we have a lot of events coming up, most notably some online meetups and KubeCon Amsterdam. So get ready to go to Amsterdam, come by our booth, come say hi. We're gonna be doing some fun stuff that involves me behind a camera with you, so holler at your girl. You can find me on Twitter at Patricia_Dugan and Traefik at Traefik. So there we go. We did just release Traefik Enterprise Edition 2.0, so I will put a blog about that in the chat box. And now let's talk about what we have going on today. I am very excited to be with this person, Chris Wiegman. He is a senior software engineer at WP Engine, and he is going to talk about escaping big tech with Traefik 2.0. He's going to talk about how to switch to more private alternatives to big tech ecosystems, if that is of interest to you. This talk will cover utilizing Traefik and Docker for self-hosting solutions to bring secure and stable alternatives to what you may be using now. So I'll let him dive deeper into that with his cool slides, and wait till you meet him. He has a cool setup. Little things I found out about him. He used to be an airline pilot, and he also played the jazz trumpet. So if you're into music, you can ask about that, and you can ask about his flying. And then clearly, we want to hear all about what he's doing at WP Engine, so go ahead and lay your questions on us in the chat box. And as you do that, we'll answer them at the end. But if Chris chooses to, he may answer them during his session. So with that, I'm going to sit back, kick my feet up, and watch Chris talk to us. And thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Take it away, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Patricia. Alrighty, y'all. Let's go ahead and share screen here. Hopefully my screen's coming up for everybody. So as Patricia said, this is going to be talking about something a little bit different today. I don't use Traefik in an enterprise situation, which is very different than most of the talks you hear here. We've used it very heavily with building developer tools and very user-centric tools. So my experience with Traefik goes back about 2 years now, building WordPress development tools, similar to if you've ever used the products like XAMPP or MAMP or things like that. On top of that, I've used it for a lot of self-hosting solutions, which was actually an evolved use case for me. So as I've moved off of Google's and I moved off of things like that, the Traefik has been a great tool to take from dev tools and make it a lot easier, a lot cheaper for me to handle all that other stuff. Everything I have today is available online. I've already put up both the code and these slides are available on GitHub. Here's a quick link for you. wieg.co/Traefik-meetup. I'll have that link as well at the end. So if you'd like to follow along or you're interested in this type of thing, feel free to go ahead and grab the slides and the code yourself. So a little bit about me. Patricia covered it a little bit already. I'm a senior software engineer at WP Engine. I've been developing WordPress plugins for 10 years. That's how WP Engine's a managed WordPress host. My product there is, I've been on a product which just officially ended about an hour ago called DevKit, which used Golang and Traefik to build a local development solution for our customers. I'm now working on a product called Local, it was previously Local by Flywheel, which is a more GUI based. It's entirely Electron, TypeScript, things like that. Unfortunately, does not use Traefik right now, but we have some other uses where we're looking at in the future. I've been a teacher. I've taught computer science at St. Edward's University and other places. I speak at WordCamps and other conferences like South by Southwest. As Patricia pointed out, I used to be a pilot. And a lot of my focus with all of this tends to come back to privacy, development workflows, and the open web. So we're going to try to put a little bit of that together here on this talk today. If you're looking for me online, you can find me at chriswiegman.com. And I'm pretty much Chris Wiegman at just about anything you would need, whether it be Twitter, GitHub, you name it. So let's talk about a little bit why I put this talk together. Like I say, my focuses are very heavily around privacy. So trying to keep something privacy and Traefik focused, I decided let's take a talk from what I've been dogfooding with Traefik. I started with Traefik, as I said, as something that we were using to build developer tools. When we're building, so many developer tools, localhost and port number, that didn't really translate well to WordPress users. And of course, we could do Nginx proxies, and there's other kinds of reverse proxies that will handle this. But Traefik made for a really great solution for that. And as it's evolved for me, it's become my solution for almost all my self-hosted items. And the reason I'm doing that is largely for privacy. I do appreciate the better control and owning your own data. All the reasons that people tend to self-host things, right? Escaping the walled garden. But most of all, a lot of this project for me has been fun. I've learned an awful lot about Traefik. I've learned an awful lot about how I handle some of the Docker stuff. My role is not officially DevOps, where we were building Docker-based dev kit or development solutions. They were not on enterprise levels. We're not using Kubernetes or Swarm or any kind of orchestration. We're using very raw tools to run things on people's individual computers and small servers. So that's been a lot of fun for me to be able to dig into this type of technology that with a developer role, I wouldn't really be able to be exposed to otherwise. So let's talk get a little bit deeper as to what I'm going to talk about replacing here. Because this is still a talk on escaping big data. This is a talk on escaping big dev, big tech. Let's talk about some of the things I'm actually going to demo a little bit. We're going to replace some file storage, notes, photos, newsreader, chat, Google Calendar, contacts, tasks. All those types of things are things that I've been able to replace. And thanks to Traefik, I basically have everything on a single server. So I've replaced almost my entire Google account and about 6 other accounts with a $5 DigitalOcean instance and Traefik. It's helped me reduce costs. It's $6 a month for a G Suite account. I still have 4 that I haven't shut down yet during this project, but that's $24 a month and moving pretty much all of that to a $5. It might eventually be a $10 DigitalOcean instance. So it does keep hosting costs down for me. It's a very simple implementation, and it helps me containerize all the things. My goal with this has not been to maintain. I had started this project earlier, and I was self-hosting each service with setting up the individual service on its own server, and I'm having to maintain everything. That's really not sustainable in the long term. So I've moved everything into, I've containerized everything at this point for the sake of maintenance. And we're going to cover a little bit about how we can keep some of this like Traefik up to date as well, if you're doing it for this type of thing. Let's talk about that a little bit about what Traefik is. For the, I don't, unfortunately, I will say right out, I don't know the experience level in this group. I've looked at the previous webinars where a lot of DevOps folks are involved in these webinars, but all the feedback I've gotten so far has been by largely people who haven't touched Traefik. So if this is familiar to you already, please feel free to mute me for a couple of minutes. If not, let's talk a little bit about what Traefik actually is and how we're going to use it. Traefik's a reverse proxy. We're taking a number of domains, whether it be an API, we can actually take MySQL, we can take TCP connections, route them all through Traefik and back into one place. So we can get your web server, everything goes out through here, and Traefik handles all the routing. It can handle your load balancing, it can handle all kinds of services. It's really a very versatile solution for routing services throughout your internal network. And in order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about how Traefik works. The 2 things that when we do this for this type of project, this is a smaller scale project. We're not going to get into the full power of Traefik. When you're running something self-hosted on your own server, you're most likely not load balancing things across dozens of servers. You're not scaling up to maintain loads of hundreds of thousands of concurrent users. You simply want your stuff available when you need it. Getting started with Traefik, which is geared largely toward the enterprise user, can be a little bit confusing. And one of the biggest topics that confused me when I started it was the difference between the static and dynamic configuration. Traefik has two types of configuration. It is its startup, which basically how you configure Traefik itself. And then it has this dynamic configuration, which is fully dynamic routing. You know, how do you assign a host name to a service? For instance, if you spin up a new Docker container with the Traefik, with a dynamic Traefik configuration, Traefik will go, oh, hey, here's something new. Okay, I'll add it to the list that's available now. Those are all dynamic configuration items. Most of what we're going to be using here and most of how I'm going to break this down is going to be dealing with the dynamic configuration. And I want to point out that if you start going beyond my talk and you start looking up how Traefik works and you're looking up examples, the way I've listed my dynamic configuration, I put everything right in Docker Compose. It's easy for me. I've been working with Docker for a long time. It's not the only way to handle things. Your Traefik config file, there's different formats that can hold the same types of configuration. There's a lot of, Traefik's very unopinionated in how it wants to take its configuration. So that's something to keep in mind as you go through. You could, if you start taking my examples and looking through Traefik docs, you'll see them listed in different ways in various different places. And other, of course, on other blog posts people do on Traefik, as there's quite a bit out there right now. Getting beyond that, let's talk about what the three parts of Traefik that we're actually really dealing with here. This leaves out services, which is another big part of Traefik if you start getting into load balancing and some larger stuff. But for a smaller setup, we're really interested in the routers. We want to take a domain name and we want to get it to our Docker container, whether it be Nextcloud, a website or something else. We need to deal with middlewares. It's one thing to say assign a domain name and take it to the service. But what if we need to inject headers? What if we need to handle some sort of regex rewrite or something similar? Middlewares are going to handle that part for us. And finally, the biggest one that we're dealing with here is providers. There are a few different providers. This is the back-end provider of your service in Traefik, of your container. In this case, we're dealing entirely with Docker. There's file providers, there's other types of providers that can deal with this in Traefik, but for our purposes and the way we've handled configuration in this webinar, we're dealing entirely with the Docker provider. So as I talk through some of these terms, these are the types of things we're dealing with. The router handles the routes, middleware modifies things within the route, and the provider is the target of what we're trying to route to. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And when I say middlewares in some of these examples, let's talk a little bit about what middleware can do. It can enable SSL. In this case, we start with a router and we say its endpoint is one thing. Say its host, enable SSL here, and then tell it to cert resolve. This is actually a bad example of middleware now that I'm saying this out loud, quite honestly. But one of the things we can do as we handle these routers is we're going to turn on SSL. We can redirect to that SSL. This is more appropriate for middleware. So we have a middleware called redirect scheme, and we set the scheme to HTTPS. So anything that hits this route, if it's not HTTPS, it's going to redirect to a different route. We specify where the route is listening. It's listening onto a web entry point. I'll show you that in a second. We specify the host that it's listening on, and then we attach this middleware to a router. So we say router service HTTP, which is what we've defined up here. We're listening on HTTP with this URL, and we've attached a middleware to it, which is simply this redirect scheme up here. So now this is a quick, dirty way of saying anything that's not on HTTPS, we want to enforce SSL traffic. So this is something you probably want to do on any local services that you're setting up for yourself. Another example of where we'll use this, and I've used this specifically in Nextcloud in my examples as we go forward, regex redirect. So in this case, Nextcloud has well-known services, so you can look up what's the card dev service, what's your calendar service, your contact service. We're using regex to handle these, and that's an example of a middleware that we can attach back to our router. And all these attachments, it's a single line. You set your router up, you specify your middleware, and you go back and attach it with a single line. Specify middlewares equals my middleware and provider. One thing to keep in mind with middlewares, and this has probably been the hardest part of dealing with Traefik for me locally, is it has limitations. It can't do multiple things. As you'll see as I demonstrate Nextcloud, I really need middleware to do two things for me. Inject an HSTS header, which is a type of security header. And I wanted it to handle that routing that I showed you in the previous example, which was the card nav contacts calendar routing. It won't do that. It's actually a little bit of a bug that has to do with an upstream provider. You can only do one thing at a time with a middleware. Worse, or not, maybe not worse, but you can only assign one middleware per router. Where this says equals, middlewares equals my middleware, if I had two of these, it would simply take the last one. So if I did the CalDAV and then I did a security header or some other types of middleware I need, it would only take the last one assigned. If you have multiple routers, you can assign a single middleware to each router. As you'll see in my examples, the SSL redirects, that's a separate router, so it gets its SSL redirect middleware. But the final one can only, each one, and then there's a separate router for the SSL traffic. Each one can only take a single router. So that's something as you look at services, and these are just a few services that I run myself. If you expand beyond this, different services may have various complex requirements, and you'll need to find different ways to handle that. Especially, I would recommend using different ways to handle your rewrites. Try to keep it within your application. Things like that is how I've handled most of the workarounds for myself. Where I'm putting all this stuff, if you want, you can take the repo that I've put in the link. You could upload it to DigitalOcean, change your domain names, fill out some config variables, and run it on a $5 instance, and you'll be good to go. So this doesn't require, if you want to experiment with this stuff, it doesn't need anything fancy. You can run it locally if you'd like to. You probably want to remove the SSL. You don't want to be pinging Let's Encrypt constantly locally, but you can run this all locally or on, at the most, a $5 instance. This isn't something that's hard to experiment with. So let's go ahead and get started. This is all done in Docker Compose. I'm going to flip back and forth a little bit with this, but what we're essentially doing is we're just spinning up a Traefik container. We're using the newest version of Traefik 2.1. We're exposing ports 80 and 443 because all we're dealing with this demo today is websites. Always restart. And we're setting some items that we want to map to it. So for each one of these, acme.json holds your certificates, all your SSL certificates for each service you spin up. Traefik will take care of SSL for you. If it sees a new domain name and it says it's supposed to have SSL, it'll go out to Let's Encrypt, take care of all that for you. If you bring it down, it'll be persistent, so on and so forth. And it stores all that persistent data in this acme.json. There's a traefik.toml configuration file, which is mostly static configuration for it. And then I've mapped the temp folder. That largely had to do with concurrent reasons. When I was bringing things down, it seemed to be a much slower thing if it had to spin up a new temp folder. It's helped speed things up. I don't know if there's any real merit to that beyond that, but it is something I found tends to work pretty well when dealing with Traefik. Let's split this out a little bit too and look at that traefik.toml file. Here's our traefik.toml file. This is mostly static configuration. We specify log level. All we need is errors. I don't really want to log absolutely everything going through this thing. We specified our provider, which is Docker. I'll get into this a little bit deeper coming soon. We've specified what our entry points are. We only have 2 entry points on this. And an entry point is what ports does Traefik listen on? Nothing more than that. 80 for web. And then we have we called it web secure, and it's 443. And then finally, we specified how we're going to look up certificates. We specified a certificate resolver called default that's using Acme, storage, acme.json, specify your email address, and then it's going to use a TLS challenge. If you're familiar with the different, when you use Let's Encrypt, there's DNS challenges, there's TLS challenges, there's different ways that you can authenticate with Let's Encrypt. So in this case, we've just simply used TLS challenge, which basically means as long as the domain name is pointed to the right server, and it can find, Let's Encrypt can make everything work and see that that domain name's reaching here, you'll get your certificate. It's a pretty basic thing to handle. That's all the configuration we've needed to do for this. This whole, what is it, 19 lines, including spaces, will handle all of our information. And that's what we're mapping back to Traefik here. But there's a couple things that I want to really dig down to when we're dealing with Traefik on our own. Unless you're a security professional, unless you're spending full time on this, we want to add a few other containers to Traefik. And we want to do this to keep it secure. The first one I highly recommend is Watchtower. This is the Watchtower Docker Compose block, and I'll bring that up in a second. But Watchtower simply is going to look every 300 seconds to see if there's an update for your container. And if it does, it'll handle that seamlessly, including getting rid of all the old container, the image files. So it's not going to fill up your disk, and it's going to make sure that any security updates that are released with these new containers are going to come through to you. Only catch I would recommend on something like this is don't try to use latest containers. If you're familiar with Docker, everything's tagged. You can tag a version of a container. I don't recommend using latest unless you want to risk any, if a container releases breaking changes, you would get breaking changes too. So when I listed in our Docker Compose, when we look at Traefik here, we pin it to version 2.1. If you've used Traefik before, version 1 to version 2 was a complete breaking change. If I had listed latest on this, it would have automatically updated for me to from 1 to 2. Now, as I go further, Watchtower will keep me pinned on 2.1 so I can make sure that I'm not going to break anything. I'm only getting those security updates. I'm not getting new features or anything else that would cost me a lot of time on my weekend. So that's the first thing I highly recommend to keep in your Traefik stuff updated. As you do that too, there is one thing that you need to turn on each container that you apply Watchtower to. It's just this enable true label. That's just saying, you might have a container in there you don't want to update at all. If you leave this off, Watchtower won't deal with it. If you map this, Watchtower will look at every container that you say enable true to. There's a second part to this. Well, 3 really. We want to divide some networks up, and what this comes down to is Docker. You don't necessarily want Traefik going straight to your Docker socket file. It has full access to your machine. So if there was any kind of vulnerability, if a misconfiguration or something else on your part that allowed somebody into your machine and could get to that Docker socket file, you're going to break things pretty quick. They can own your machine. You have a very big potential vulnerability there. So this does a couple things. First, we're going to split off all of our external traffic is going to go to a default network driver, and all of our internal traffic for this alone is going to go right here. So we specify 2 separate networks, and we're going to add another container to handle this. On this Traefik network, we're going to add a Docker proxy container, and it's using this Tectoniva Docker socket proxy image. What this does is we map our Docker socket to this, and on port 2375, it goes back out and says, here's everything that Traefik can reach. Traefik has to come back in on TCP, then to Docker, and it can only access the functions in Docker that it needs. It no longer has root access to your machine via the Docker socket. You can see this here in Traefik, we've specified Docker proxy. We've specified that Traefik network because Docker proxy, that 2375 is only listening on the Traefik network. So we're keeping it separate so nothing's available. And then we specify it in the Traefik config itself right here. So we're listening on the Traefik network. That's what this TCP connection's for. We're no longer mapping the Docker socket. Most things, when you start looking at intro to Traefik documentation, you're mapping the Docker socket directly to Traefik. You don't want to do that. Proxy it through this, and it'll be a much more secure, much safer setup for you. So that's the really big item as you watch out for here. Just make sure that you're keeping things updated, get your security updates, and make sure you're not exposing yourself to things that you shouldn't need later on. A few items as I walk through this. This is just that same block here. Finishing the Traefik config, that's the same thing I just flipped over and showed you. And then we should be good to go to adding some services. We're going to add a few services. Nextcloud. Nextcloud is basically an all-in-one Google's G Suite replacement. Wallabag basically replaces things like Pocket or InstaReader. It's a self-hosted service that'll clip anything, save the whole full text and all this for you. News readers, if you want to get off of Google News, or if you're still bitter like a lot of us are on Google Reader back in the day, you don't even need to worry about it anymore. Fresh RSS is a really solid news reader. And then URLs. I do a lot of URLs links for presentations, hence the wig.co link that you saw in the beginning of this. That's all hosted on a URLs box. It's the same service as this thing. To get to this first, we're going to need a couple supporting services. Maria.db. Notice as I've done this, I've enabled Watchtower on my Maria database. Notice there's no Traefik configuration. Not every service you use, and this is kind of a big thing when you're dealing with Traefik, needs to go through Traefik. Traefik can support your MySQL database. It doesn't need to. If you're using Nextcloud and you want things like Collabora or OpenOffice, which is full online editing with Nextcloud, it's easy. It's fully available. There's a lot of good tutorials on it. It doesn't need to go through Traefik. It's running its own port. It can go around Traefik. You don't need to open those ports just for it and play that configuration game. So again, really, I just illustrate this as an example of watch what services you need. If they're going on the web, put them through Traefik. If they're not, it's a one-off service on its own port. You don't need to play that game. Just like everything on here, the idea with this thing is I can kill this Docker, the Docker Compose at any point, restart the server, whatever. I want to make sure all my data is persistent, and you're going to see that across. So all the volumes that you see mapped in this code are just simply to make sure that your data is persistent. Because I mean, it's important anywhere, but it tends to be more so and less stressful, if nothing else, when you're dealing with this on your own. A little bit of config files on this MySQL root. What I recommend doing, and if we look at our code here, each one of our containers has env file. So instead of risking accidentally putting something that you might commit to your GitHub or other repo with a root password, keep the files separate, ignore them from Git, and then you don't have to worry about accidentally putting credentials online. There's so many stories out there in tech of so-and-so accidentally left the AWS bucket credentials, S3 bucket. So now somebody's huge database is available on the web. Don't do that with your own personal data. This is just a pretty quick and dirty way to make sure that you don't have to deal with that. The other one that we're going to use for this is Redis. Pardon my click to add title. This is admittedly a new slide program for me. I didn't quite clean it up because I didn't need to or couldn't do a full slideshow the way this setup works on Zoom. But Redis is just used for same thing as MariaDB. It's a backend for Nextcloud and a couple other services. Just enable Watchtower for it, make its data persistent, you're good to go. On every item that we need to enable Traefik on, we're also going to have to add one label. The simple Traefik.enable equals true will enable Traefik on any of the following containers that we need it on. And let's break down a few of these containers as to what they are. The first one, fresh RSS. I'm going to flip from here to here because I think this is a little bit easier for everybody to read where I'm zoomed in here. So we've declared fresh RSS. It depends on Maria, it depends on Traefik, and it depends on Watchtower. It has its own little config, and I'll show you what the contents of that are in a second. Image fresh RSS. This one I'm using latest. Earlier I said don't use latest unless you really need to. Their update mechanism basically says always keep on latest is what they advise for their Docker. So that's what I'm doing. I've enabled Traefik. I've set up the middleware to redirect to SSL. I've set it up to listen without SSL and then attach that SSL redirect. I've set up my SSL site in order and use the default cert resolver, so it'll use Let's Encrypt. And I've enabled Watchtower. The only thing you would want to change on this if you were to upload this to your server is change the URLs in this, and you'll be good to go. This thing, so now you're listening on both SSL and non-SSL. You're forcing everything to SSL. You've got an SSL certificate installed, and all your configs are taken care of. It's actually a really simple config for fresh RSS. There's no database stuff or anything to worry about. You're just specifying it's how often it checks feeds and your time zone, in this case, Chicago. The next service we talk about a little bit is Wallabag. Wallabag, like I say, it's like a pocket service. And if you look, this is going to look very familiar. Scroll down here to where I have it. The only thing we've added is Wallabag likes Redis. Its config handles it by default, but we've got a config file. Here we've pinned it to a version. We're listening to Watchtower and MariaDB as well. And these labels are almost identical. Every one of these labels as we go through, turn Traefik on, redirect to SSL, enable our site on SSL, and use the cert resolver. The only difference is the URL. So if you update your domain here again, you're going to have basically the same thing. Of course, networks only listen on default, and then we're just, each service has a little bit different data mapping, so we want to make sure that we handle that correctly as well. Notice each one of mine is .data volumes. If you look in the sample code that I put on GitHub, there's a data folder, but no volumes folder. You could specify that volumes folder anywhere. If you want to put it as an external, you've mounted an S3 bucket. If you've mounted block storage on your host or something else. So you don't have to keep this data on your server. You just want to map that data volumes to wherever you are keeping this. So it's just another way to be a little bit more flexible depending on what you're hosting, where you're hosting, and how you want to handle data. If you have a terabyte of data on your own side for Nextcloud, you probably don't want to try to put this on you can't put this on a $5 DigitalOcean instance because it's 25 gigs of space. Adding block storage tends to be a dime a gig at a lot of places. But if you go to S3, now you can get something really cheap, and this is flexible enough that it'll handle that for you. Flip back over to this side, the Wallabag config. This is a little more in depth. All these things should be pretty self-explanatory. Database name, MySQL root password, database user, and extra secret, which is a C, just a random string, database password, and then all the rest of these should be pretty basic. You're setting up you don't want the public registering for your own stuff, so we've turned the stuff like that on. Turn off confirmation for registrations because you simply don't need it. Make sure you specify car set. Everything's pretty basic as far as what configuration is here. Just make sure before you bring Docker Compose up, you fill out each of these fields that you need. Next one's URLs. And this is going to start sounding like a broken record at this point because we're doing very similar things with URLs. Maria, Traefik, Watchtower, a config file, URLs 1.7, SSL redirect, listen on SSL, turn traffic on, so on and so forth. Again, the only thing we're changing in this configuration is what we're mapping, is the URL itself. The configuration file is also pretty basic here. Maria.db, username, database, password. Notice this doesn't ask for your root password. You have to create the database ahead of time. So if you've spun up your MariaDB, go in there, create whatever database and user you're listing here, and make sure you set that. And then a username and password for URLs itself so you can log into its admin. Further information on any of these are available within their own documentation. I'll walk through each of the services a little bit at the end here just so you can find more information on them, but it's all pretty straightforward stuff. The biggie here then becomes Nextcloud. This is my Nextcloud configuration. You notice there's a little bit more in middleware. Let's flip over and look at that a little bit more deeply. Again, same listeners, Maria, Redis, Traefik, and Watchtower, but we have an extra set of middleware here. This is the CalDAV redirects. Basically, it wants to see that when you look at Nextcloud, it has in its settings, it has an overview, and it'll tell you various security warnings, and it'll tell you things like redirects that don't work. It would warn you if this wasn't working on redirects. So this particular Nextcloud configuration, combined with, you have to look up an HSTS app for it to handle the second piece of middleware. Ideally, if Traefik worked in its dream state, and I'm sure they'll get it to this at some point, I would also add a set of headers here for HSTS expiration, which has to do with how your SSL, it's a little extra security stuff without getting too technical on it. It wants a very specific expiration date. Traefik can handle setting this header, but it can't do both that header and this CalDAV redirect. So what I wind up doing is installing an app in Traefik that sets the header itself. It's a little bit more convoluted, a little bit hard to figure out if you're not familiar with why Traefik might be failing on that, but it'll make sure that your settings everything is secure and everything works as they intended to. Once you get past CalDAV though here, everything else is the same. SSL, Traefik enabled, certificate enabled, Watchtower enabled. It's basically cut and paste from one thing to another. And I keep bringing that up for a reason. You can take a lot of these minus the hosts and put redirect rules. You know, for instance, you can have a single middleware specified in your Traefik.toml that would keep you from having to put some of these lines in each time. Each service to me is a little bit different. Each service works a little bit different. Every time I've tried abstracting that in the case of Traefik and Docker, I always find that exception later and I go, well, I really shouldn't have done it that way. So for the couple of extra lines it takes here, I kind of recommend breaking those out. It's different in an enterprise environment where you're dealing with thousands of servers or thousands of dynos or whatever you have going that you might be trying to orchestrate things with. But for a simple setup here, I really do recommend keeping your dynamic configuration within your service blocks. Excuse me. That's the big, so those are the 4 services that I have running here. Coming back here, all of our different labels broken out. Once again, this is pretty simple configuration for Nextcloud.env file. Database name and MySQL user, Redis host, basic stuff like that, and you'll be up and running. Last thing I want to talk about is that I mentioned that HSTS. If you try to install Nextcloud, it used to be, if you go to your apps screen, you had this HSTS as an available app right there. It's not the case anymore. So I did want to put that note up as I've called it out as one of the harder things to configure for Traefik. You have to manually download an app. Nextcloud's a PHP application, so this thing's really easy to install. It takes about 10 seconds to upload the file. You know, it's a tar file or zip file, extract it into your plugins directory and you're good to go. But make sure that you are manually installing that if you're running it through this type of configuration. That's what I have. At that point, we've replaced just about all of our Google services. Notice I didn't call out photos. I run photos through Nextcloud. I run calendar through Nextcloud. I run contacts, files. There's online editing, which I don't use, but could be used if you needed it to. There's a whole lot of things there that Nextcloud can run just right off the bat. There's apps for pretty much anything you have out there. I've actually found, if you are a G Suite user or a Dropbox user, I found, at least in small instances like my own data, Nextcloud Sync seems to actually work better. So it's kind of a bonus for me. But nextcloud.com has more information on that if you're interested in looking at that. Wallabag.org has Wallabag, and if you want to try it out and play with it, if you don't want to deal with hosting it yourself, I think it's $9 a year, so it's pretty cheap if you want to do it that way, or it might be €9 a year. Fresh RSS is the same type of thing. This is the RSS reader. Works great with Nextcloud because you can just, if you want to save things for later, just post them in there. The URLs instance I'm running, there's a little bit of extra documentation in there, but nothing that you would need to worry about too much. And then the final thing that I would recommend bookmarking if you're going to get into this is docs.traefik.io. Remember, Traefik is not spelled as a American would spell traffic. It's Traefik. Docs.traefik.io has basically everything I've talked about here, including the different configurations. You could tell I grabbed my one image directly from their website, but this is where the full configuration items and all the different middlewares, all the different SSL and TLS options are listed on their docs site. They do a very, very good job at their documentation. That's what I have for my talk through today. Let's open up to some questions.
Yeah, and I'm gonna hop in here. I don't need to be the middle person, but I just want to say, like let's open it up to questions, like Chris said, and I see a lot of people that I've never seen before, and some who are Traefik ambassadors who I have seen before. So welcome. So if you've never been here before, just know that we're super inclusive, and you can ask whatever you want in the chat box as long as it's respectful, and Chris will handle it. Ivor, one of our amazing Traefik ambassadors who's from Berlin, is here. Ivor, do you have any commentary you'd like to make on what you saw today, or thoughts? Haha, he's probably doing something else. And then Loic, thank you for coming here also and staying around though it's late in your day. Did you have any thoughts around what you saw today, and any questions around this? And John, thanks for your question about what was it? I presume you can give each of this its own subdomain. Do you have any further commentary on that, Chris?
Yep. Hi, John. By the way, I know John personally, so I'll make sure his product manager knows he's in the. My wife is his project manager, so I'll make sure she knows you're busy. All jokes aside, yeah, you can assign whatever domain you want. What I recommend doing is I keep a domain that I don't have any public sites on, with the exception, of course, of URLs, because I'm giving the URLs out here. But I keep a separate domain that I use just for my own self-hosted stuff, and I assign a subdomain for each. Nextcloud.mydomain.com, freshrss.mydomain.com. You can split them up any way you want. You can have top-level domains. Traefik doesn't care as long as the domain is addressable to the machine. Traefik will take whatever you give it for each service.
Interesting. Cool. I want to say that you're an amazing educator. I really like this. So John is saying, everyone, that last time he tried setting things up that he was using another alternative and it was messy and difficult. Yeah.
I've had the same problem. Really, what brought me to Traefik initially was the dynamic nature of it. When you start dealing with HA proxy or Nginx proxies or everything, you have all this stuff that you need to restart all the time. Traefik, you can bring up and down containers at will, and it doesn't care. So not only is it less messy, it's a little confusing dealing with that dynamic and static configuration at first, but once you get past that, it's so much easier than anything else.
You know, I have to say that is something that I hear all over the place, which is that's a main differentiator from the alternatives to Traefik, which is that you don't have to restart. You can just kind of keep going and make these changes.
Very much so.
The time saver is what I'm hearing. So Kasim, and I'm sorry if I didn't say your name right, but we have a thought question here. I really don't understand how, if you don't expose the 8080 port, how Traefik redirects to port 80 for the dashboard. Does this do it only if the API.insecure flag is on, or am I wrong?
You're actually right on, Quasim. I don't use the dashboard. In production, I don't find it necessary for, I have, in this case, 4 services. My own personal configuration actually adds a few different ones in different, depending on my needs at different times. But as long as they're running, I don't use the dashboard for that type of thing. You can keep in mind that if you expose your dashboard on something that you're not monitoring on a daily basis, especially for something, I mean, this isn't your day job for the types of services, but this is data that's important to you. So everything that you expose is one potential item should a vulnerability come up that provides information out there. So I do not recommend keeping the dashboard on at all in production. Docker Compose logs is 9 times out of 10 adequate to troubleshoot any kind of problem here. You can turn on secure mode, or you can add an entire another set of routers for the Traefik dashboard if you'd like to. But again, not something I recommend in production on this level of service.
Cool. Any more security tips other than Docker socket proxy? And I actually missed Raj Kumar will answer yours in a second.
Most of the biggest security tips I have are don't overexpose yourself. Just as I was talking about with dashboard, if you don't need it online, don't put it online. Any information that is available on your setup is one other potential vector should a security vulnerability present itself later. Also, of course, make sure you keep things up to date. Watchtower is excellent at that. 9 times out of 10, you look at any basic security or any security blog post, it all comes back down to the same few things. Keep updated. Know what your services are. Don't expose things you don't. Make sure you use a strong password, right? So here now we've kept updated. We're not exposing the Docker socket. That whole Docker socket proxy container will take care of that for you. And we're handling everything else that we need at that space. We're not showing the dashboard if we don't need it. Make sure you're setting strong passwords. I would recommend on the MariaDB, set up separate individual databases for each service. Maybe a Nextcloud database for Nextcloud. FreshRSS for FreshRSS, WordPress for WordPress, whatever it might be, keep those databases separate with separate users for that same type of isolation, and you should be good to go.
Cool, and I love hearing that someone got educated to Watchtower today, so you're such an influencer. Yeah, so that's all the questions that have come in.
We want to get Raj Kumar's, sorry.
Go for it, do it.
Raj Kumar, you did ask if we had the Docker Compose in GitHub. We do. I've posted the link down here, wig.co. I can probably share the screen back, wig.co/Traefik meetup. Let me share that screen back. Nobody wants to look at me anyway. There you go. Docker Compose, the Traefik Toml. There's some extra plugins from URLs that I use that I've left in there. I basically change the domains, fill out your configs. It has example config files on each, so copy them to .envs. And you can get this thing running probably in the next 20 minutes if you'd like to.
Oh, there's a question about where else people can find you, Chris. You know, your teachings, the teachings of Chris.
most of what I have is on my own site, chriswiegman.com. I'm sure they'll be in this link will be in the show notes as well. You can also find me at Chris Wiegman on Twitter, on GitHub, on you name it. But any previous talk, if you're into WordPress, I have a lot of WordPress talks online. You could watch the full talks, things like that. Pretty much everything's kept here, though.
Yeah, and Chris, you know, if people are on Twitter, Chris, you know, will be responsive to you live there. So that's pretty cool to find his education there. And then people like our Traefik ambassadors will jump in and have comments too. So very cool. Looks like we have something else. Chris, you want to take that? I'm happy to read that.
Where are we?
Maybe use, oh, this is a comment. Maybe use Docker secrets instead of environment variables.
You know, I've played with that back and forth. Some of the containers I've had problems with when I was getting into Docker secrets. Of course, it's probably been a year and a half since I investigated that myself. And I was using various containers because some of the people who are maintaining the containers are somewhat new to, you know, they're building a PHP or whatever app, and they didn't always work for me. So I've wound up going back to environment variables because I found them to be the most reliable. There are Docker secrets. You can look them up. I'd be willing to bet probably everything on here that they would work with now, but I have had problems with them in the past for whatever reason. It's just another option.
Sweet. And what's your name? Reza, cool. I love the name. I have lots of friends named Reza. I'm a very beginner using Traefik. So by the way, Reza, please go to our community forum. I tried to use HTTPS plus Let's Encrypt automatic certificate resolver, but Traefik is using the default self-generated cert. Any hint on how to debug or understand what's wrong in my configurations?
Best bet is look at Traefik logs. Docker, I'm going to type assuming you're using Docker Compose, I'm putting the command that should help with that. Docker Compose logs Traefik might give you a lot of information there. Typically problems that I have are the DNS, you know, I forgot to set up a DNS entry, so it's not getting back to the box. Watch that TOML section and make sure that it's configured to use TLS challenge and put in the right spot, so on and so forth. Make sure that the Acme file has the correct permissions. It should be 600. If the Acme file is not correct permissions, it won't write to it. You wind up back in the self-cert. But that Docker Compose logs, or if your service isn't named Traefik, change it to whatever your service name is, will typically tell you what's going on and why it can't handle SSL on that. Kazim's back to why would you use env in production? Lots of projects do. I come from the PHP world where that's a fairly common thing to use .env in production. They're not available on the web. Your root site of your folder is not available at all. So in this case, using .env files, that's how it's recommended to use .env files. If you're not using Docker secrets, env files are fine. They are not available. Gidia.chriswiegman.com. Good catch. My stuff is on GitHub. I'm not sure. I'll double check my site for that link. I've actually pulled down the Gidia site. Gidia is great, but it doesn't integrate with CI, and I needed too many things that needed CI, so I've gone back to GitHub for now.
Yeah, I am so happy with the diverse group we have who showed up. We'll post that GitHub link again right now. And it is our pleasure to everyone saying thank you for your time. I personally have really enjoyed listening to Chris, and Chris, any comments you want to say to your audience, and hopefully you've enjoyed yourself also.
Yeah, it's fun. Thanks y'all for coming. Some good questions on this. Reza, find me on Twitter. I'll be happy to try to answer a couple questions for you there. It sounds like you have a very specific issue going on. So feel free to DM me and I can provide you a couple of options.
Yeah, and I mean, we have a little time if this is something you want to explore here, but like you say, Chris, it sounds like maybe something a more quick dialogue one-on-one.
For sake of Reza, asking too many questions might lead to information that probably shouldn't be on your recording. So
Yeah,
let's make sure I keep that offline.
yeah, it's actually, as you mentioned, once you go live, as someone told me along my journey in tech, you can't put the egg back in the chicken. So
Exactly.
there you go. Okay, well, everyone is heralding Chris. You're an amazing teacher. I agree. Thank you so much. We look forward to you firing up a big plane and taking us on a ride. And next time you can play the trumpet. Thank you so much. And as we always do here, everyone, virtual fist bump. And what happens now is that this video will go to YouTube. I will send this to you via email, and also you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you'll be notified when this becomes live, and we will watch it over and over and really be grateful for Chris's time and his expertise. So again, find me on Twitter, Patricia_Dugan. At Traefik is also an amazing place to find upcoming meetups, upcoming events, your other Traefik ambassadors, and people like Chris that we chat with there. So thank you so much, and we'll see you for the next one. Chris, any parting words?
No, thanks, y'all. Appreciate it. A lot of fun. Looking forward to participating more in this community.
Yay. Have a good day, everyone. Stay happy. Bye.